Welcome to this edition of the MBN Iran podcast. With me today is Ilan Berman, Senior Vice President at the American Foreign Policy Council and a member of the Board of Directors of MBN. We have lots to talk about today. You have a broad area of expertise, and I know we've had conversations about this before that I'd like to dig in deeper today. So a few years ago, you wrote a book called Challenging Moscow's Message about Moscow's propaganda efforts in the rest of the world. Well, here we are. There's the Iran war. There's lots going on, and there are different global narratives. And I'd like to start off by asking you, what's the story behind Iran's messaging? The war's gone on it's been 3 months now. The world is watching, listening. Social media is ablaze outside the region, all over the place, Latin America, Africa. People talk about it. How is Iran doing its messaging? Is it working? And what's the message they're putting out there for outsiders to read and listen and watch online?
Oh, I see. We're starting with an easy question.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So I think that's exactly right. There's a lot to unpack there. So I would sort of highlight a couple of different dimensions of it. First of all, I think it's necessary to understand that we are now coming out of the single longest internet blackout in modern history. Right, the Iranian regime blacked out the internet on January 8th of this year when it wanted to, under cover of this informational blackout, to really clamp down on the protests that had broken out a couple of weeks prior. Those restrictions mostly remained in place. They eased a little bit, and then they were reimposed when the current conflict with the United States and Israel broke out. What that has meant as a practical matter is that we are getting only part of the Iran story. We have been getting it for approximately a quarter of a year. The Iranian voices that you hear online, that you see online on platforms like X or appearing in the media, these are all regime-approved messengers. They're all promoting a message that the regime is resilient, that the regime is in charge, that America and Israel have really failed to strategically alter the country's trajectory in any meaningful way. The stories we're not hearing are the stories of what it actually looks like to live inside Iran, what the economic conditions are, what the social conditions are, how the regime is repressing the domestic population in order to prevent another uprising. These are all crucial stories. But up until now, up until just a few days ago, we haven't heard or seen anybody tell them because of the regime's blackout. So that's the first part. The information environment has been very artfully managed and manhandled by the Iranian regime. And the appearance that has emerged is of a much more consolidated, much more competent and unified Iranian leadership than is the case if you read Iranian sources, if you sort of look at speeches by different Iranian officials of the remaining regime. The other part of it is the question of where the information space goes from here. Because Iran, like every other authoritarian regime worth its salt, is building a mechanism to better contain the information flow in the country. And in the Iranian context, the operative history goes all the way back to 2009, to the summer of 2009, when the Green Movement broke out in Iran in opposition to the re-election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. And the regime found out, at that time it was comparatively unsophisticated informationally, and it found out that information is the lifeblood of the opposition. The opponents, regime opponents at the time, protesters, they were using the internet, using social media platforms and chat boards and things like that to coordinate their organization, their responses. And so what happened very naturally was that the Iranian regime followed the protesters online and throttled the Green Movement online, and it stayed there ever since. And so what you've seen in the intervening years are these, series of government restrictions, a series of technological acquisitions with the help of Chinese companies like ZTE that has given the Iranian regime a much better handle on the information space. But it hasn't stopped there. And the thing that I'm watching, I think, very closely is something called the National Information Network. Because like every other authoritarian regime, like China, like Russia, Iran is, even now, even in the throes of an economic collapse, even in the throes of all these hardships, is investing in a system to try to wall off its population from the World Wide Web. The National Information Network is a pretty sophisticated endeavor, at least on paper, because it envisions not just blocking Iranian access to outside websites, but creating domestic homegrown alternatives to YouTube, to X, to things like that, that would essentially shunt Iranians into a regime-approved online reality and wall them off from influence from the West. So the system, right, the back of the envelope calculation is the system something like 60% done. But there was a real question among people I talked to, I'm sure people that you talked to, during the course of the current conflict, about whether the Iranian internet was even coming back. And it seems to be coming back, and I think, I mean, we can sort of unpack why it's coming back. But this is not, I would argue this is not an indefinite condition, because it's very clear to me that what the regime wants to do at the ultimate end stage of its manipulation of the infosphere is to control that online reality. And so they're going to keep pouring money into these resources, and it's going to become harder and harder to reach Iranians in the months and years ahead.
And to tell the story of what's actually going on. I know that when I've tried to reach people inside Iran and people I know who have family or whatever, you know, you think about what does the internet shutdown mean? Well, it means basically you don't have access to any form of communication, and actually making a phone call is very expensive. And the thing as well is that if you're going to be on the phone, somebody's listening, so people are taking risks. But that leads me to the question of how the world, the rest of the world, if you're a young person somewhere else in another country, you're kind of following what's going on, you're going to get an Iranian narrative as well. So they've walled off their own population from outside influence, and at the same time, they've walled off the world from knowing what's going on. If you think about the massacres on January 8th and 9th, I mean, they just mowed down thousands of people, but there's scant footage of it. People were diving for cover and being killed. So already there's a problem of not knowing what's going on. And it's not a vacuum, oh, we don't know what's going on. They are pushing their own message. They invest huge amounts of money into foreign media. I mean, they have broadcasters in different languages. So what is that like? You know, as somebody who's quite informed about state propaganda efforts, are they good at it in your view? What's working, what doesn't for the Iranian regime when they're pushing out their message?
Right. So the one little sort of caveat I would add is we haven't seen what's happened in the last quarter year in Iran yet, because one of the functions of the internet blackout has been that Iranians haven't been able to upload large size videos, haven't been able to upload the type of content about precisely what you're talking about the massacres, about the sort of the human toll of the protests. That may come out, and you know, I'm hopeful that as Iranians become more and more online, we do get a little bit more information that allows us to provide accountability. But you're absolutely right in the sense that the machine that the Iranians have built, and by the way, right, everything is sort of is a scaling issue. So the Chinese are spending, right, the back of the envelope calculation is they're spending $10 billion a year on propaganda and you know, messaging, international broadcasting. The Russians are spending something like $2 billion a year. The Iranians aren't spending that. They're spending something like $800 million a year. But still, in an economy that's basically cratered, with a national currency, the Iranian rial, which has lost, you know, 99% of its value. This is a real investment. It's a real investment because money is fungible, and if it goes there, it can't go to some place else. And it really connotes that the Iranians feel like this is a good investment. This is a good sort of project for them to invest in. It's also a project that's getting a lot of injects from other sources. So the experts that I talked to, that you talked to during the initial blackout that happened earlier this year, I think there was this conventional wisdom that the solution to all of our Iranian internet blackout problems was Starlink, right? The sort of the space-based internet pioneered by Elon Musk, that all we have to do is flood units into the zone and everything would be fine and the Iranians would be back online. And that didn't happen. What we had was we did have the importation, overtly and covertly of hundreds of units, but experts I talked to were saying that the Iranians that they were in contact with were feeling like 50 to 80% packet loss in terms of not being able to get their information out. And that was a function of assistance from Russia and China, because Russia and China provided jamming equipment that allowed the Iranian regime to be more sophisticated and more effective in containing that external messaging. So to me, the big takeaway is, this is all part of a broader pattern, but the big takeaway here is Iran is very good at this sort of media manipulation, but Iran also has assistance. Iran, insofar as the broader frame of this is that we're seeing increasingly close collaboration between China and Russia and Iran in this, axis of upheaval or whatever you want to call it, across multiple domains. Information is one of those domains. And so they're getting the benefits of potent messages that have worked in the Russian context and the Chinese context that they're repurposing, common messages that are being amplified not just by Iranian media sources, but also by Russian and Chinese media sources, and also technical expertise.
So how do you fight back? Who's fighting back? Is the West doing anything or just sitting there and taking it? Is America doing something?
Right. Certainly less than we should. And this is something that we've seen over the last year and a half that I think is a capability that we really need to sort of to rebuild, to optimize, to fix for the deficiencies. Because as part of its critical look at the federal government in general, the Trump administration has taken a hatchet to the international broadcasting capabilities run by the U.S. Agency for Global Media. And by the way, I think a lot of those critiques are totally sound. I think there's a lot of problems that have to do with U.S. AGM in terms of content, in terms of functionality, in terms of efficiency. But that all begs for optimization. That doesn't necessarily beg for dismantlement. Because the problem with dismantlement is there's no replacement, right? And up until now, right, as we're recording this, I haven't heard to my satisfaction a sort of a fulsome American information competition strategy, right? And maybe it's not that we want to broadcast all the places that we were broadcasting before, but at the very least, we need to retain a capability to punch back against mischaracterizations of the United States and to push back when American adversaries like Iran or Russia and China are promoting a narrative that's false and that's harmful to the United States. And the problem that we've had is that we've sort of thrown the baby out with the bathwater as part of our look at this.
What would a pushback look like?
I think it's a good question. There is, I think the way I would answer that question is to first suggest that we start thinking about what information Iran doesn't want its people to have. Right? The image that Iran is projecting to the world is that it's a consolidated regime, that it's it's firmly in charge, that it has bested the United States in this contest. It's also trying to project an image of religious legitimacy. What we've seen, in effect, in Iran over the last 2 months has been a military takeover. Iran looks much more now like a military junta than an Islamic republic. The problem with that is that creates a credibility issue for the Iranian regime, because the whole point of the regime's legitimacy hinges upon the existence of a supreme leader, the existence of this clerical line of control. So stories that talk about the disposition of the still missing new supreme leader, stories that talk about the way the regime is managing or mismanaging the economy, stories that talk about the fact that the Iranian regime has been forced to import foreign militiamen from places like Iraq to keep control of the Iranian street. All of this contributes to this understanding, or a better understanding, that both audiences in Iran and audiences in the region should have about how the Iranian regime is not firmly in charge. It is a pretender to the throne. It is subject and susceptible to pressure, right? I think that's the start of an answer.
It's reminiscent to the Soviet Union, which for basically 7 decades had this narrative that it was the worldwide global protector of the proletariat, of oppressed peoples around the world, and so on. And it basically was this kleptocracy of a bunch of old men who had their control the population with the security apparatus and so on. And when you begin to think about it in those terms, that's exactly what we have now, is that the ideology is just basically a shadow, and it's something that they work in the name of, and ostensibly that's what it's about, but it's really a bunch of...
No, that's totally right. And I mean, think about it from the context of the IRGC. Right now is the best of all possible worlds with regard to the IRGC. The IRGC is the most significant strategic actor inside the Islamic Republic. And in order to remain the guardians of the Islamic Revolution, there has to be an Islamic Revolution to guard.
Yes.
And so it's not an accident, it's not a bug, it's a feature that they are hiding behind the clerical robes of the supreme leader. But you have a supreme leader who is incapacitated, absent. He's issuing edicts by email or text or whatever.
If he's even issuing them.
If he's even issuing them. But somehow, magically, they comport to precisely what the IRGC wants him to be saying anyway.
Yeah, funny.
So they've created this perpetual motion machine where they don't have any hard questions about their legitimacy and the legitimacy of the regime, and yet they have ideologically, the entire freedom of action.
So, the Iranian regime has been very adept at exercising power abroad. One thing that's always struck me is that, with the exception of Iraq, which is a neighboring country, a lot of what it's been up to has been in countries that it doesn't even border on, right? So we've seen the shift, we've seen the changes come, we've seen what's happened with Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis and so on. Let's talk a bit about other ways. I mean, has their proxy effort, has it transformed? Has it grown in other areas? What's going on with the proxies in your view?
Well, so I think this is precisely the right question, because the great philosopher Mike Tyson once said that everybody has a strategy until they're punched in the face. I think there's wisdom in that, right? The second part of the saying is probably something like, what matters more is how you adapt after you've been punched in the face, right? And he could, he was talking back, obviously, when he sort of made the reference, he was talking about, the fact that, the type of punching power that made him what was known as the baddest man on the planet, right?
Yeah.
But in reality, he could have been talking about Iran today, because what you're seeing is that in the midst of all these difficulties, the economic and political difficulties, in the midst of, and let's be clear, the conflict looks like it's devolved into an uneasy stalemate, and it looks, depending on the day, it looks like Iran has the upper hand. But the reality is, we've seen massive, massive destruction of Iranian capabilities, right? If you, the commander of U.S. Central Command, Admiral Brad Cooper, recently testified on the Hill, and the laundry list of capabilities that the U.S. military has attrited in Iran is pretty significant. It doesn't mean, by the way, that we've won, but the laundry list is pretty significant. So the Iranian regime has a problem. They're trying to solve a problem. They've been punched in the face. How do they adapt? And so what you're seeing and is a real sea change in terms of how Iran is interacting with what's colloquially known as the Global South, right? They're promoting much less a sectarian Shia message, much more a sort of a unified pan-Islamic message, which tries to rally both Sunnis and Shiites to their side against Israel and the United States, and against regimes, Abraham Accord countries, for example, that have backed those two. But they're also building additional proxies. So there's a new proxy with the acronym HAYI, H-A-Y-I, which has emerged only since the start of the conflict, right? But they've already carried out attacks against Jewish sites and financial institutions in Europe. And the European and North African law enforcement officials that I've talked to, they're pretty convinced that this has Iranian DNA, right? That this is an Iranian proxy group, right? So it's that type of innovation that we really need to keep an eye on, right? Because the challenger isn't standing still, right? Their adaptability and survivability is the key.
And it's interesting, I mean, they've had cultural centers in Latin America for years. I mean, they've not been slow in spreading and cultivating a message, and it is that kind of message of the global oppressed, somehow or other rallying behind their patron or spokesperson in the form of Iran. So how does this play out? Because what you're describing is there's a message going out there that isn't being pushed back against, although they're wounded. They still have the capability of starting up new proxies. So basically things are sprouting up in different places that they're creating, and they're not stupid. They know that why not? It's better to create something, cause problems in someone's backyard. So we're entering into this long drawn out kind of conflict. You have these sort of slow simmer conflicts, whether it's, let's say, Afghanistan and Pakistan periodically shelling each other, border skirmishes. For a long time, it was Azerbaijan and Armenia, border issues. You could even argue the First World War, trench warfare, this massive movement in the first few weeks and so on, and then it just sits. Right. Is that where we are now? Is this just going to sit? The whole sort of, U.S. and Israel on one side, Iran on the other. The Strait of Hormuz is now the area to tussle over. Things are clogged there. Iran doesn't want to budge on the nuclear program. So it's just this daily, nothing's happening. Right. So what can happen now?
So it's interesting because I think on the one hand, there's still reasons for long-term optimism, right? If you look at all of the empirical data that was coming out of Iran before the current conflict, you have this mass secularization that was taking place. You have this mass disaffection built around economy and society.
Inside Iran.
Inside, yeah. And these are all factors that Iran's remaining leaders have to contend with, right? So they may have averted that immediate danger of regime collapse, but they're still on the defensive, I think. And there's still, what we're going to see over the next, near to medium term is a much more repressive internal situation as they try to get their handle on precisely those issues. I think Western strategy tends to be very top level and tends to be very near-term focused. And so there's a sense that in the United States that there was an expectation on the part of the White House that the conflict was going to turn out a certain way. Maybe the Iranian regime collapsed entirely, or maybe they just simply capitulated. But either way, the current circumstance was not foreseen. And so what we have to do now is we have to think strategically about what a Cold War with Iran looks like.
Yep.
Which is this regime, hope springs eternal, but this regime may be around and may be with us for some time in its current form. How do we deter them? How do we isolate them? How do we message to the Iranian people? How do we do all these things that became part of standard foreign policy and strategic practice during the decades of the Cold War against the Soviet Union? I think we sort of have to dust off those plans and figure out what worked then and what might work now.
What I'm struck by, as we kind of wrap up, is you think about Nazi Germany, right? The Nazis came to power in 1933. World War II didn't start until September of 1939. For 6 years, they were doing terrible things, and they began very quickly internally in Germany. And then the world became involved basically because they invaded Poland and they'd already started annexing places and so on. And then, it took 6 years of warfare, and then it finally sort of imploded. What I'm struck by is that the world is so focused, understandably, on what Iran is doing, in terms of its aggression, the proxies, and what it's doing externally. And there's only periodic reference because of the reasons that you brought up. We don't know what's going on. We do, but we don't have pictures to prove it, of what they're doing to their own people. And so I think a key question is going to be a settlement or an accommodation or a kind of modus vivendi between the West and Iran, in which they don't visibly cause tumult in the West. Maybe they pull back in the proxies. But then are the Iranian people left still living under essentially a Nazi-type regime, right, that hangs people, has the second highest execution rate in the world, and does what this regime does to his people? And I think therein, of course, lies...
Yeah, no, it's a huge challenge. And frankly, if we understand, and I think it's the correct assessment, if we understand that the Iranian regime is now going to work overtime to limit and ultimately to eliminate the ability of Iranians to understand what the U.S. is trying to do, what the U.S. is trying to say, we have to redouble our, to come full circle, we have to redouble our efforts in the information domain precisely because of this, because we have a pretty good sense, or we should have a pretty good sense, of what information the Iranian regime does not want its people to have. What we don't have yet is a good idea of what we want to say to them. And, sort of narrowing that gap and figuring out the capabilities, the circumvention capabilities, the new technologies, the AI-assisted algorithms that would help us pierce that veil is going to be, I think, all-consuming.
Ilan Berman, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the MBN Iran podcast. Thank you again to our guest Ilan Berman today. And you can check us out on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, on YouTube, and of course on the MBN website. And stay tuned for more.